Hey, good morning. This is Ben Hankin for MBA 510. This is assignment 6, a summaries of chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13 is all about power, influence, and the politics within an organization and their structure. Right? And the book starts out with talking about, hey, power is defined as the potential to influence someone else's behavior. And the book breaks it up into two forms of power: position power, which comes from an individual's position within the hierarchy, right? And then also personal power, and that stems from an individual's characteristics. And we'll get into that in just a second. And the book also emphasizes that effective leaders tend to rely more on personal power. I think we've all seen and experienced that. The chapter moves on to the nature of power in organizations and basically says, hey, power is a fundamental component, right, of organizational dynamics, and it's necessary to understand it and study it, right? And that moves on to the book talking about the leadership motive pattern, right? Where a researcher talked about, hey, came up with the fact that, hey, a driver of a leader's performance doesn't necessarily and isn't necessarily the need to achieve, but the need to obtain power, right? And that led him to develop the leadership motive pattern. And this is generally associated with performance of managers on a high scale, so higher managerial performance. The chapter then breaks up the personal and positional power into 7 subunits, which we just talked about, right? So under positional power, you have legitimate power, right, where your authority is derived from your position in an organization. You have reward power, where the leader has control over rewards that are valued by others. And the last one under positional power is coercive power. Dangerous, right? But you have control over punishments, and you have the innate ability to inspire fear in those who you lead. Under the personal power, you have the expert power, where your powers derive from your knowledge or your skills or your expertise in whatever field you have, right? Then you have informational power, where your power is controlled, or your power comes from your control of information, right? You have referent power, where, hey, listen, the influence you have and your respect and power you have is through the respect and admiration you have from the followers. And then also you have persuasive power, where your power derives from your ability to use logic in order to persuade others to do what you need to do. Right. The chapter then moves on to some strategic applications and how you acquire power. Right. And understanding how to acquire, use, and share power is critical. Right? That's one of the big things that came out of this portion of the chapter. Right. Under the previous ones we talked about, hey, listen, referent expert power, those are always appropriate. The book mentions, although they're not always effective. Right, legitimate and reward power, those rely on external motivation, as we've seen. And the book also stresses that coercive power is rarely appropriate, right, and should be used sparingly and as a last resort. Under this acquisition of power, right, so you have, hey, the book expands upon acquiring power, where if you want to increase power, leaders or individuals should develop their own expertise, right? This goes in expertise power. You want to make sure your work is relevant, right, and is visible to the people above, the decision makers, so they see your leadership potential. The book also talks about some abuse of power, where, hey, unchecked authority is one of the biggest causes of power abuse, right? The chapter also talks about employee empowerment, right? Where, hey, listen, it's best if power is shared, right? And then employees have the authority to make decisions for themselves, right? In order for this to happen, managers must actually allow the employees to have that power to make the decisions, to take the responsibility for the outcomes, right? And the managers also and the leaders must also provide training. They also must provide the skills and that is going to develop the confidence necessary for the people below them, or the people beside them, to make the decisions necessary. And this was shown in the case study as well. The chapter then moves on to subunit and departmental power, right? Where, hey, listen, some conditions that must be present in order to enhance a subunit or department's power is, hey, resource scarcity, right? Centrality, substitutionality, right? And uncertainty. The chapter also talks about the dynamics of influence, right? I like this portion. So some of the common influence skills or tactics or actions taken, right? So you have coalition tactics, where, hey, listen, you want to help engage others in order to come over to your side, right? You have consultation, right, where you basically require advice or you set goals in order to increase your ability to maintain those goals, right? You have exchange, integration. You have inspirational appeals, right? So you basically want to appeal to somebody's ideals, values, or what you think that they can achieve, right? And you also have legitimizing tactics, where you basically talk about rules and directives and precedents, whatnot. We use a lot of these sparingly, off and on, a combination of these in the military. And we'll get into that in chapter 14 when we talk about hierarchical structures, right? Some other portions of that is so pressure. You also have rational persuasion, where you basically use logic and facts in order to make a case for why people should follow you. The chapter also talks about upward influence, right? And that's the ability to influence superiors. And how you do that? Well, you can flatter them, right? So that's ingratiation, right? So you also have exchange, rationality, assertiveness, and they also have like upward appeals. The chapter then moves on to organizational politics, and it basically says that, hey, quote, social influence attempts directed at people who can provide rewards that will help promote or protect the self-interests of the actor, end quote. That's what organizational politics is, according to the chapter, right? And hey, listen, they're just a fact of life, and we've all experienced it, no matter how close or far we are from DC, right? Some political tactics or some political actions that the book outlines. Hey, listen, one of the big ways is controlling information. You also control the agendas and what happens in meetings. Right? You can also leak information. We've seen that happen on a national scale recently, right? You can also but do managing your image, right? You also want to build coalitions. We see this in politics all the time. All of these are just stuff that can happen on a subunit or departmental level that we see happen on the national stage, right? The chapter also talks about impression management, right? And we talked about this in a couple previous videos where, hey, listen, it's much harder to change a bad first impression than it is to make a good first impression bad. So first impressions matter so much, right? And controlling the message, that's super important for gaining and maintaining power. Okay. According to the book, right, the impression management is basically, hey, I want to portray a desired image, right? I want to portray a desired image or attitude, and I want to control how the world sees me, how others perceive me, right? And sometimes it can be deceptive, right? It's not inherently bad, but if you use it the wrong way, it can be deceptive, right? Some ways that the book talks about detecting deception is, hey, listen, you can have involuntary, what it calls, quote, involuntary nonverbal cues, right? So body language is some studies talk about, hey, listen, that is really what delivers more than half of the message. It's not what I'm saying, it's what I'm doing with my eyes, it's what I'm doing with my hands, what I'm doing with my eyes when I shift. Am I shifting, looking up to top left, top right when I'm asked a yes or no question to indicate whether I'm lying, right? So and there's also talks about, hey, listen, fidgeting hands and stuff like that, right? So chapter 13 is all about power, influence, and organizational politics. Super interesting, super relevant to what we're at today. Moving on to chapter 14, this is all about organizational structure. Right? And this is really broken up into 5 characteristics that the book talks about. So division of labor, the span of control, formalization, hierarchy, and centralization. And we'll build upon some of the things we just talked about in chapter 13, and especially in my role in the military, we're talking about hierarchy and centralization, right? These structures exist between basically 2 ends of the spectrum. On one end, you have the mechanistic organizations, right? So they're rigid, they're centralized, they're usually best suited in a stable, non-changing environment, right? And then you also have organic organizations, and those tend to be more decentralized and flexible, and their ability to adapt to change rapidly, right? So some of the common structural types that the chapter talks about is functional structure, divisional structure, matrix, team-based, lattice, and network, and we'll get into that in a later part of this video. The chapter then moves on to the foundations of organizational structure, right? And basically, organizational design is the function of managers of selecting and managing different aspects of the structure and the culture in order to align to where the organization wants to go, right? And the whole outcome of this process is a holistic organizational structure, one that's readily understood and readily executed across the entire department, organization, company, what have you, right? So the importance of the structure, right? So structure is important, right? You have to have some structure in order to have some semblance of stability, right? It leads to efficiency and less conflict, right? It also influences how an organization operates, right? And we see this in the military and outside the military too, right? The chapter also talks about some core characteristics of a structures or of an organization structure, right? And the chapter talks about 5 key characteristics, right? So the first one we talked about, right? Expanding upon it, the division of labor. That's basically, hey, listen, to what extent do the employees specialize in their set of tasks, right? Are they generalists or are they specialized? They have a niche portion of it, right? The span of control, right? So how many people report directly to an individual manager, right? A hierarchy. Hey, It's the degree to employees have authority over others, right? How tall is your organization, or how flat is your organization, right? The chapter also talks about formalization, right? Basically, that's to the extent at which the organization or departments or companies' rules and comms are written down, and how well are they followed, right? We have unwritten rules and written rules in the military, much like any other organization as well. And also, the last of the five characteristics is centralization, where this is the degree to which decision-making authority is concentrated at higher levels or is spread along the workers, right? The chapter then moves on to some key determinants, where it talks about the key determinants of organizational structure, right? And you basically have internal, external factors, and that's no rocket science, right? So some business strategy, right? So the structure of your organization must support what strategy you have for the business, right? The external environment is super important. The organizational talent, right? The size of an organization, and this is where the case study comes in with the treehouse, right? Smaller organizations tend to be a little more organic, and then the larger you get, the more hierarchical you become, and that's just a necessity, right? Some behavioral expectations. What are the expectations of the behavior of your company, of your employees, of your constituents, right? So, are you expected to be collaborative? Well, then maybe a decentralized structure is a little bit better for you. Are you expected to adhere to strict protocols or strict guidelines or strict rules? Then maybe a hierarchical structure is more in line for what you need, right? The chapter also talks about some typology of the structures of organizations, right? And basically, hey, listen, organizations evolve, right? So they start out at the pre-bureaucratic structure, where they basically found a new, burgeoning, early on organizations, right? A lot of one-on-one communication, low standardization across the board, and then they move into a bureaucratic structure where they basically adopt the structure as organizations grow, and the necessity for efficient comms up and down the chain of command become more necessity. Right? The chapter also then moves on to some grouping of employees, right, and some common bases at which organizations group employees. And this isn't rocket science, right? So the individual employee knowledge and skill. What function do they work in, right? Are they in business? Are they in marketing? Are they in engineering? Are they in product testing design? Right? So you group them via what function they have, right? Also the output, where they are. Location is a big thing nowadays, right? You'll have an East Coast base, you'll have a West Coast base, you'll have a Southwest base, you'll have a Europe base, right? And the chapter then moves on to some structural types that it talks about, and we talked about this earlier. So you have functional structure, right, where you basically talk about the people have similar skills. The divisional structure, right? So it's a collection of organizations around a specific area, market, product, area of the code, right? So that's a division. We also have a matrix structure, which it talks about, hey, listen, the employees report to both a project manager and a functional manager. We have this in the military. We have an operational chain of command. We have an administrative chain of command. When I'm on watch, when I'm overseeing the reactor, right, I always report to the captain, right? But for ancillary administrative things, I might not go to my engineer, right? I might just go right to my XO because he deals with administrative stuff, right? Or if I'm on watch and I need to do something with the reactor, I might go to my engineer who's the technical expert, and then I'll go to the captain, right? So I have an administrative chain of command and I have an operational chain of command. This is what I'm talking about here, right? So you have functional managers and you have project managers. And then the last one it talks about, or the last couple it talks about, so team-based structure, lattice structure, and then I like the network organization, a collection of autonomous units. This is kind of where you want to be. This is the golden standard. I would agree. The chapter also talks about and then moves on to some contemporary issues and applications of organizational structure, right? So nowadays, virtual organizations are more prevalent than ever, right? And they present challenges in comms and control, and we've talked about that in previous videos. The chapter also talks about some mechanisms for integrating employees, right? You want to have direct contact. You can have liaisons, you have task forces, cross-functional teams. It goes in a little bit more about that. The chapter also talks about some efforts to restructure, right? And this was brought out in the case study as well, right? So the main portion or the main ideas that the chapter one gets into is that, hey, listen, restructuring should address the root cause of why the problem exists, or why is the company or division actually restructuring, right? So the restructuring must address the root cause, not the problem, but the root cause of the problem, right? And it happens as minimal as possible. And again, this was all brought up in the Treehouse Island case study. Anyway, this was Ben Hankin for MBA 510 Assignment 6, summaries of chapters 13 and 14. Thank you.